Loud music filled the air, and the aroma of expensive perfumes and fine drinks seemed to suffocate. The house, large and opulent, was the perfect setting for the boss's exclusive party. The laughter was drowned out by the sound of the saxophone that echoed through the corridors, but none of that mattered. My heart was heavy, crushed by an anguish that gave no respite. I shouldn't be there. He hadn't been invited. And yet, every cell in my body told me something was wrong. Something was about to be discovered. There was an invisible tension, like a thread about to snap. Stares followed me as I crossed the main hall, but my mind was focused on just one goal. Each step brought me closer to the inevitable, to the moment when my suspicions would be confirmed or dispelled. Her laughter sounded in the distance, a familiar laugh that should have been mine. I felt my fists clench, and anger mixed with sadness in a devastating whirlwind. As I turned the corner into the garden, a grotesque scene awaited me. The soft pool lights illuminated enough for me to see the impossible. There she was, my wife, locked in a kiss with another man, her lover. She laughed, and he whispered something in her ear. My world stopped. It wasn't just the act itself, but the place, the situation. They were at the boss's party, hidden, but still so in plain sight that the danger seemed to excite them. My shattered heart beat wildly, each beat echoing like a drum in my head. I tried to muster the strength to confront them, but my legs gave way. I heard fragments of their conversation as I hid behind a column. She said that the plan was almost perfect, that they would soon have everything they needed. He responded with a smirk, mentioning a dirty deal that involved confidential company information. It wasn't just a loving betrayal. It was a conspiracy. They were using my trust to destroy my professional life, to embezzle money and leave me in the dust. Revolt burned my chest, but the pain was even greater. How could she? How could someone who once said, "I love you," be so cruel? My hands were shaking, and a bitter taste filled my mouth. But I knew I couldn't explode at that moment. I needed to understand everything, every detail, before acting. They couldn't get away with it. They couldn't just laugh at my expense and get on with their lives. I needed to think, plan. But how do you do that when the world around you falls apart? My thoughts were interrupted when she mentioned my name. My heart froze. They were laughing at me. He commented on how easy it was to deceive me, how blindly trusting I was. She nodded, smiling, and then said something I'll never forget: "He'll never find out. Even if he does, he won't have the courage to do anything." Her words were like a sharp knife piercing my soul. The man I was at that moment has died. Something inside me changed. He wouldn't be the idiot they thought he would be. As they walked away, I decided to act. I stood from afar watching the two enter the house, whispering and laughing. Their every step seemed to echo in my chest like a reminder of betrayal. I returned to the main hall, blending into the crowd as I analyzed everything around me. There were security cameras in several corners of the house. Maybe the boss, or someone, could have the proof I needed. But how would you get these images without raising suspicion? A plan began to form in my mind, a plan that would ensure they faced the consequences of their actions. The voices around me became noise as I processed what had happened. A guest bumped into me, apologizing, but I barely registered it. My mind was focused on a single goal: justice. And deep down, a question was growing, burning like fire. How far was I willing to go to get justice? Did they deserve to lose everything like they had planned for me? Can the betrayal of those we love one day be forgiven, or can the love that existed turn into pure hatred? I didn't know yet what I would do. I just knew the truth would come out. And when that happened, nothing would be the same as before. Welcome to our channel, where no form of cheating is supported or justified. The stories you will hear here are fictional, created to show how betrayal can destroy lives, break bonds, and leave deep scars. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is an intense story, full of twists and turns and emotions. Take a deep breath, because this will be a shocking and unforgettable experience. Good story. Michael and Laura's home was a reflection of everything they had built together. Located in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, with large windows that let sunlight bathe the rooms, it was the kind of home that seemed straight out of an architecture magazine. Michael had always been proud of that. He had worked tirelessly to ensure Laura had the home of her dreams, the perfect space for them to put down roots and live in harmony. However, as impeccable as the house looked, there were invisible cracks growing silently in what they believed to be a solid foundation. Michael was the kind of man who believed in the power of effort and commitment. He had started from scratch in his career in finance, working his way up the ladder with determination and hard work. What drove him, however, was not the ambition to be the best, but the desire to provide Laura with the life he thought she deserved. For Michael, marriage was a sacred promise, a pact that required constant dedication. Despite the long hours at work, he always made a point of making time for Laura, even if it meant sacrificing moments of rest. Laura, in turn, was a magnetic woman, with a beauty that seemed natural and an engaging personality. She had always been the type of person who lit up any room she walked into. His eyes shone with intensity, and his captivating smile could disarm even the most resistant. When Michael met her, he instantly fell in love with her energy and how she seemed to see the world in such a vivid way. Laura, however, was more complex than she appeared. Beneath her radiant exterior was a restlessness that she rarely let on. She had left behind a promising career in interior design to focus on her home and marriage. The decision, although made together, weighed on her in ways that Michael might never fully understand. Laura missed the excitement of creating, the freedom to express her vision through unique projects. As much as she loved Michael and appreciated the comfort and security he provided, there was a void she struggled to fill. She looked for this in hobbies, in meetings with friends, at occasional parties, but nothing seemed to be enough. The couple's social circle was diverse and ranged from close friends to Michael's work colleagues. This often placed them at events and parties where Laura felt she needed to play the role of the perfect wife. She was skilled at it, always elegant and engaging, but with every smile, with every polite compliment, a small part of her seemed to disappear. Michael, on the other hand, saw these occasions as an extension of his work. For him, it was an opportunity to strengthen connections, show everyone that he and Laura were the ideal couple. He barely noticed the nuances in Laura's gestures, the moments when her gaze wandered around the room in search of something more. The relationship between them, although apparently solid, was beginning to show signs of wear and tear. Michael was more focused than ever on his career, especially after being promoted to a position of high responsibility. Laura tried to understand and support, but she couldn't help but feel neglected. Their conversations became routine, filled with reports of Michael's work or the domestic chores that Laura managed with mastery. There was rarely room to explore what they both really felt or wanted. Still, they found moments of complicity that gave them hope. A casual dinner at a new restaurant, a walk through the park on a sunny afternoon, or even a peaceful night on the couch watching a movie. In those moments, Laura could almost convince herself that everything was fine, that the love they felt for each other was enough to overcome any difficulty. Michael, in turn, saw these moments as proof that, despite the challenges, they were on the right path. The truth, however, was that they were both growing apart. Michael believed that his dedication to his work was a way of showing love, while Laura felt that true love required presence and attention. She wanted to be seen, heard, understood. Michael, in his attempt to protect what they had built, ended up blinding himself to what really mattered. And so, the distance between them grew, almost imperceptible, but constant. The opportunity to reconnect came in the form of an invitation to Michael's boss's party. An event that promised to be grand, full of influential guests and a golden chance for Michael to strengthen his professional relationships. He suggested that Laura accompany him, believing it would be good for both of them to get out of their routine and have fun together. Laura accepted, but reluctantly. Something inside her said that tonight would be different, that it could change the course of their lives. As they prepared for the party, Michael was excited, even optimistic. He saw the occasion not only as a chance to impress his boss, but also to show everyone what a strong and successful couple he and Laura were. Laura, on the other hand, felt strangely restless. When she looked in the mirror, dressed in an elegant dress that highlighted her beauty, she realized that she no longer knew who she was. That woman everyone admired no longer looked like her. There was something deeper, darker, that she tried to hide, even from herself. When they finally arrived at the party, Laura was immediately enveloped by the luxurious atmosphere. The music, the laughter, the lively conversations, everything seemed to conspire to create an unforgettable night. But deep down, there was something she couldn't name. A premonition, perhaps, a feeling that something was about to happen. Michael, for his part, seemed completely at ease, moving from group to group, chatting with confidence and charm. He made an effort to include Laura in conversations, but she seemed distant, almost disconnected. As the night progressed, the two drifted apart, each going their separate ways at the party. Michael was immersed in business discussions, while Laura explored the house's spaces, enchanted by the architecture and design. She felt more comfortable away from the crowd, appreciating the details that went unnoticed by many. Yet even here, far from the chaos of the party, she couldn't escape herself. There was a weight in her chest, a feeling of dissatisfaction that wouldn't leave her. Michael, upon realizing that Laura was no longer by his side, began looking for her. He knew she didn't always feel comfortable at events like this, but he believed his presence could help her integrate. As he walked through the halls, greeting acquaintances and smiling at strangers, a doubt began to form in his mind. Was he doing enough? Was Laura happy? And so, on that seemingly ordinary night, Michael and Laura set out on paths that would lead them to their breaking point. What began as a celebration would end up revealing truths that neither of them were prepared to face. Fate seemed to play with them, moving the pieces of a game whose outcome no one could predict. The party continued at its peak, with laughter breaking out between the chords of the live band. Laura had moved away from the superficial conversations of the main hall and ventured through the elegant corridors of the mansion, observing the details of the impeccable design that filled every corner. For her, this was a way to escape, to find a moment of peace amidst the noisy confusion of people who couldn't stop talking about business, strategies, and investments. It was as if she could hear her own thoughts there, even though those thoughts brought more questions than answers. Michael, on the other hand, was engaged in a lively conversation with some colleagues. He had lost sight of Laura and, despite his usual confidence, a slight uneasiness was beginning to form in his mind. He knew she wasn't a fan of these parties and, deep down, he felt something was different that night. Something about her expression, the look she gave him before disappearing among the guests, seemed to suggest a distance he couldn't fully comprehend. While Michael tried to convince himself that she was okay, Laura slipped through the shadows of the illuminated garden, feeling the night wind caress her face. She was tired of the pressure to always be perfect, to live up to expectations, to live in a world where her voice seemed muffled. At that moment, she just wanted to feel alive again, even if it was for a moment, even if it meant going beyond the limits she had imposed on herself. It was then that she crossed paths with a familiar figure, someone she hadn't expected to see there, but whose presence seemed both unexpected and inevitable. He smiled at her, and the smile had something dangerous about it, something that attracted her in a way she preferred not to admit. The man, whose charm was undeniable, struck up a casual conversation, but there was an underlying tension in his words. Laura let herself be carried away by that moment, by the attention he gave her, something she had been missing for a long time. At first it was just an innocent conversation, but their growing closeness quickly began to surpass the limits of what was acceptable. Meanwhile, Michael finally decided to look for Laura. He walked the halls, the hallways, and even the garden, wondering why something as simple as finding his wife seemed so difficult that night. His heart started to beat faster, but he didn't know if it was from worry or a feeling that something was wrong. He began to notice that some people were looking at him strangely, with smiles that seemed to carry secrets he didn't know. Something was happening, and he was at the center of it, even if he didn't understand it. Laura, in turn, felt a mixture of excitement and guilt. The man she was with seemed to know exactly what to say to make her let her guard down, to convince her that this moment was harmless, that she deserved a little freedom. They laughed, toasted, and each moment made her feel further away from the reality she had to face. She knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't move away. Something inside her pushed her to continue, as if it were an act of rebellion against everything she had been repressing. Michael finally saw her, and what he saw made his world stop. Laura was with another man, closer than she should have been, laughing in a way he hadn't seen in years, touching him in ways he recognized as intimate. He stopped, frozen, unable to process what his eyes saw. Time seemed to slow down, and everything around him disappeared. The only thing that existed was that scene, that betrayal that unfolded before his eyes. He felt the ground disappear beneath his feet, and a mixture of anger, pain and humiliation washed over him. The words he wanted to scream caught in his throat, and he found himself unable to move, as if the shock had paralyzed his body. He didn't know what to do, what to say. The only thing he knew was that nothing would be the same as before. Laura realized too late that Michael was there. When her eyes met his, she saw something break inside him. The smile disappeared from his face, and the color seemed to leave his body. She tried to speak, tried to explain herself, but the words wouldn't come out. The man next to her realized what was happening and backed away, trying to escape the situation, but the damage was already done. Michael took a step back, as if trying to escape the reality around him. He felt a lump in his throat, but he didn't let any tears fall. He just turned his back and started walking away, while Laura stood there, unable to follow him, unable to move, trapped in her own guilt and regret. Michael's path out of the party was a blur. He couldn't hear the sounds around him, he couldn't feel the touch of the people who tried to stop him to talk. His mind was in a state of chaos, and the only thing he knew was that he needed to get out of there, he needed air, he needed a moment to process what had happened. While Laura remained behind, alone, surrounded by people who whispered and looked at her with judgment, Michael walked towards something he didn't yet understand, but knew would change everything. And deep in his heart, as the weight of betrayal crushed every piece of who he was, a question echoed, a question he couldn't ignore. How far was he willing to go to understand what had really happened that night? Michael felt solid ground beneath his feet as he walked toward his office, but his mind felt like it was in a sea of chaos. After the party, he spent days immersed in silence, revisiting every detail of what he had witnessed. He couldn't erase from his memory Laura's smile, her gestures, her complicit laughter with the other man. However, what tormented him was not just betrayal, but something deeper, something that seemed to lurk in the shadows, beyond what his eyes had caught that night. The decision to investigate what was really happening came almost instinctively. He knew there were cameras in his boss's house, and he clung to the hope that they had recorded something more than his mind could comprehend. A discreet phone call to the boss resulted in a plausible excuse: he needed the security footage to verify possible irregularity. The boss, without suspecting it, promptly sent the videos. While watching the material in his room, Michael saw the scene that had destroyed him again, but now from a different angle. Laura and her lover were talking with a smile that seemed sharp like a blade. He turned up the audio volume, trying to capture every word, and that's when everything started to make sense. They talked about him. About his position, about accesses and passwords that Laura had at home, things that he never imagined were relevant. It was a well-orchestrated plan, something that transcended emotional betrayal. They were using him. Michael pressed the pause button and closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his breathing. Every word, every gesture, was a piece of a puzzle that was finally put together. The lover was not just any man, he was involved in a scheme to embezzle money from Michael's company. Laura was the key, the link between them, and that hurt more than any intimate betrayal could. He didn't know how long he sat there, motionless, as the video file remained paused on the screen. But eventually the pain turned into determination. He knew he needed to confront her, but not just because of what she had done. He needed to hear from her, needed the words to come out of her mouth, for the truth to be told, even if it was a truth that tore him apart. That night, Michael waited for Laura in the living room. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. When she entered, surprised to see him there, he observed her attentively, noticing every detail, the slight tremor in her hands, the gaze that avoided his, as if she already knew that something had changed. He began calmly, but there was an unmistakable tension in his voice. He asked her about her lover, about what she really felt. She tried to talk it out, saying it was a mistake, that it didn't mean anything, but Michael interrupted her. I told her that I knew everything, that I had proof, and that she could no longer hide the truth. Laura's reaction was a mix of shock and despair. She denied it, tried to justify it, but Michael stood firm. He wanted to hear the truth, not the lies she used to protect herself. And that was when she finally gave in. With tears streaming down her face, she admitted she was involved but tried to downplay her role, claiming she never wanted things to go this far. Michael heard her, but his gaze remained cold, distant. He asked how she could do this to him, how she could use the trust he placed in her for something so dirty. Laura, sobbing, tried to justify her actions, saying that she felt trapped, suffocated, that she found in her lover a way to escape her own unhappiness. But Michael didn't want an apology. He wanted the truth, and she finally admitted that she had given information to her lover, that she knew what he was doing but never imagined Michael would find out. Michael's anger finally came to the surface. He raised his voice, something he rarely did, and demanded to know why. Not just why she cheated, but why she chose to hurt him in such a calculated, cruel way. Laura, with nowhere to run, confessed that she had been manipulated by her lover. He convinced her that Michael would never forgive her for her failures, that she needed something more in life, something he could offer. She believed, gave in, and now she was paying the price for her choices. Michael stood up, unable to stay there any longer. He needed air, space to think. Before leaving, he looked at Laura, who was breaking down in front of him, and said that he didn't know if he would ever be able to forgive her. He left, leaving her alone, lost in her own guilt. Outside, Michael felt the cold wind on his face, as if it was trying to calm the fire burning inside him. He knew what came next wouldn't be easy. But he also knew that he needed to move on, somehow, even if it meant leaving behind everything he thought he knew about his life and about Laura. Michael drove aimlessly through the city, the streetlit streets passing by in a blur. The silence inside the car was suffocating, contrasting with the turmoil in his mind. He knew he needed a plan, but anger and disappointment kept him from thinking clearly. Finally, he parked at a small park he used to visit in the early years of his marriage. There, in the middle of the night's tranquility, he tried to find some meaning in everything that was happening. As he sat on one of the wooden benches, he remembered how he used to come here with Laura to discuss their dreams and plans. The irony of the situation hit him like a punch in the gut. Now he was alone, confronting not only her betrayal, but how blindly he trusted someone who clearly didn't deserve it. He wondered at what point things had started to fall apart, but he couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. Maybe it was a sum of small oversights, unnoticed gestures, unspoken words. Michael's phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from Laura. She desperately asked him to come home, begging for a chance to explain further. Michael stared at the screen for a few moments before sliding the phone back into his pocket. He didn't know if he had the strength to face her again so soon. The echo of her words still haunted him, each confession eroding the foundation of everything he believed about his marriage. After an hour, he decided to come back, but not to forgive her. He needed answers. The silence in the house was almost as loud as the sound of his own breathing as he entered. Laura was sitting on the sofa, her eyes red from crying. When he entered, she tried to speak, but he raised his hand, asking her to wait. He needed to lead this conversation now, he needed control over the narrative. Laura looked at him, her face a mix of relief and fear. She tried to justify her actions again, saying that she was lost, that she never wanted to hurt him like that, but Michael interrupted her. He wanted to know every detail, from when it had started, how she had gotten involved, what she really knew about her lover's schemes. Each answer Laura gave seemed to be more devastating than the last. She admitted that her lover had convinced her that Michael no longer loved her, that he only saw her as an extension of the house, an invisible person. And at first, she believed it. But as the case progressed, she began to realize that she was being manipulated, used for a greater purpose. When Michael asked why she hadn't stopped, even though she realized what was happening, Laura broke down in tears again. She said she was afraid. Afraid that if she confessed to Michael, he would abandon her. Fear that if she confronted her lover, he would expose everything to the public, destroying not only their marriage, but also Michael's reputation. Her confession didn't bring comfort, it only deepened the hole they were both in. Michael looked at her with a mixture of disgust and compassion. He knew Laura was broken in ways he could never fix, but that didn't lessen the gravity of what she had done. He stood up and began pacing the room, unable to sit still. He finally looked at her and asked, in a lower but pained voice, if she still loved her lover. Her answer, hesitant and guilt-ridden, was a simple no, but for Michael, the doubt planted by the delay in his response seemed as solid as any certainty. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Michael looked at Laura, who looked confused. He went to the entrance and opened the door to find a man he hadn't expected, a lawyer sent by Michael's boss. The boss had discovered his lover's scheme, and Michael was called in to discuss the legal implications, including how his own wife was involved. Michael returned inside the house with a pale face, informing Laura that the case was far from just a personal matter. Now it involved legal, possibly criminal, consequences. The trip to the boss's office was made in complete silence. Laura was next to Michael, but he didn't say a word to her. When they arrived, the boss received them with a serious expression, but not without a hint of disappointment. He explained how his lover's actions had put the company at risk and how Laura, intentionally or not, had played a crucial role in the scheme. Michael listened to every word, feeling the weight of shame growing with each detail. Laura tried to defend herself, claiming that she had no idea the extent of the plan, but the evidence presented said otherwise. Michael realized that his wife had been not only an accomplice but a key player in the scheme, albeit perhaps out of naivety. The humiliation was too much for him to bear. He got up and left the room without looking back, leaving Laura alone to deal with the consequences of her actions. Outside, Michael stopped to breathe. The air felt heavier than ever, and he felt like he was sinking into quicksand. But for the first time in days, he felt a spark of clarity. He couldn't let this situation define who he was. He had choices to make, decisions that would shape his future, but most of all, he knew he needed to find a way to move forward, even if it meant leaving everything behind, including Laura. When Michael returned home later that night, he began to pack his things. He didn't make a scene, didn't say anything to Laura, who was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall. He just grabbed what he needed, left the house keys on the counter and walked out the door. As he drove away, he felt something he hadn't felt in days, a slight sense of relief, as if the weight was beginning to lift. But he knew there was still much to come. Michael wasn't sure where he was going when he left the house that night. The suitcase in the back seat was full of hastily thrown clothes, and the wallet with his documents and some savings was the only thing he had calmly picked up. As he drove through the deserted streets, streetlights passing by like shapes, he felt a growing emptiness that seemed to suck away all his emotions. There was no more anger at that moment, nor was there any obvious sadness. It was as if he had been emptied of everything that made him human, leaving only a carcass that moved automatically. He stopped at a simple motel on the side of a road, a discreet and anonymous place where he could spend a few nights while he thought about what to do next. Upon entering the room, the stuffy atmosphere and damp smell didn't bother him. He left his suitcase in a corner, threw himself on the bed with the same tiredness he had been carrying since the party and stared at the ceiling, trying to find some logic for what his life had become. As silence filled the room, Laura's words continued to echo in his mind. She had said she was sorry, that she never wanted to hurt him, but she also admitted that she had chosen her path out of fear and insecurity. He couldn't decide which was worse, the fact that she had allowed herself to be manipulated or the fact that she had used that fear as justification to betray him on every possible level. Michael felt a growing need to understand where exactly things began to go wrong, but at the same time he feared that searching for answers would only plunge him deeper into pain. The next morning, Michael woke up to the insistent sound of his phone vibrating on the nightstand. It was a message from the boss's lawyer, informing him that developments in the case were accelerating. The evidence against Laura's lover was irrefutable, and her participation in the scheme further complicated the situation. She would be called to testify, and the legal implications could be severe. Michael read the message calmly, but when he finished it, he felt the impact. Laura wouldn't just be judged morally, she would face the consequences in a tangible way, something he had never imagined for her. He decided to leave the room to get some air. He walked to a nearby cafe, where he sat at a table next to the window, watching the people passing by outside. Their lives seemed so simple, so disconnected from the chaos he lived in. He wondered how many of these people had faced something similar, how many had had their lives torn apart by the betrayal of someone they loved. The coffee he ordered was lukewarm and tasteless, but he drank it anyway, as if it were an automatic gesture to fill the emptiness inside him. While there, Michael received a call from his boss. He wanted to know if Michael intended to take any action regarding Laura's involvement in the case. The question was direct, almost cold, but Michael understood why. The boss couldn't afford to let emotions interfere in such serious matters. Michael responded that he needed more time to process everything, and the boss agreed, but made it clear that actions needed to be quick and decisive. Michael returned to the motel feeling the weight of the choices he would need to make. He knew that no matter how he acted, there would be consequences, not just for Laura, but also for himself. He spent the entire afternoon staring at the ceiling, trying to chart a path that would allow him to move forward without carrying regrets that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But he knew that any decision would involve inevitable losses. Later, he received another message, this time from Laura. It was a long text, full of apologies and declarations of love, begging for one last chance to talk in person. Michael hesitated before answering, but eventually agreed to meet her. He knew he needed closure, something that would allow him to put an end to the confusion that dominated his mind. When they arrived at the agreed location, Laura was visibly shaken. Her eyes were sunken, and her face showed wear and tear that she seemed to carry like a physical weight. She began speaking before Michael had even said anything, spewing out quick, choppy words as if she were desperate to be heard. She told her version of the events again, but this time in more detail, explaining how her lover had involved her in a cycle of emotional manipulation and psychological pressure. Michael listened carefully, but his expression remained impassive. When she finished, there was a long silence. Michael finally spoke, but his words were calculated, without the weight of emotion she had expected. He said he understood his reasons, but that did not justify his actions. He reminded her of how he was always there for her, how she could have trusted him instead of allowing someone else to infiltrate their lives. Laura tried to argue, but Michael raised his hand, asking her to stop. He said he wasn't there to argue or blame, he just needed closure, something to help him move forward without carrying the burden of unanswered questions. Laura started to cry, but Michael didn't come over to comfort her. He felt a strange calm in that moment, as if he had finally found some form of acceptance. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could choose how he faced the future. He stood up, looked at her one last time, and said he hoped she learned something from all of this. After that, he left, without looking back. On the way back to the motel, Michael felt a lightness he hadn't felt in days. He knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but for the first time, he felt there was a way out. He drove slowly, allowing the silence of the road to envelop him like peaceful company. At that moment, he realized that although he was still hurt, he was also free to rebuild his life however he wanted. And that was something no one could take away from him. The days that followed the last meeting between Michael and Laura were marked by definitive changes. Michael decided to leave the motel and temporarily settle into a small apartment he had found in a discreet neighborhood. It wasn't luxurious, but it was exactly what he needed, a space that provided him with silence, anonymity, and the opportunity to reorganize his thoughts. He knew he still had a lot to face, but he was determined to take control of his life again. Laura, in turn, faced the consequences of her choices. The subpoena to testify in the case involving her lover arrived quickly, and with it, a weight that seemed unbearable. She was alone now, with no one to support her emotionally. Her lover, realizing that the situation was falling apart, had disappeared, leaving her to deal with the chaos alone. The house, once a symbol of the comfort and stability Michael had provided, now felt like a cold, empty place. Laura spent her days there, lost in thoughts about everything she had destroyed with her own hands. The trial was quick and direct. The evidence presented against the lover was overwhelming, and his conviction came without surprises. He would receive years in prison for fraud and money laundering, and the destruction of his reputation was complete. For Laura, the situation was different. Although his participation was considered less active, his complicity could not be ignored. The court ruled that she must perform community service and pay a significant fine. It was a decision that weighed more on his conscience than his finances, but the damage to his reputation and personal life had already been done. Michael decided not to appear in court. He didn't need to see the outcome to move on. His focus was on rebuilding his life, and he knew that didn't include Laura. He returned to working more intensely, finding work a distraction that helped him avoid the painful thoughts that insisted on arising in the quietest hours. However, he also realized that there was more to life than just work. The nights in the empty apartment began to feel less lonely when he decided to reconnect with friends he had neglected over the years. It was in one of these chance encounters that Michael met Emily, a friend of one of his coworkers. Emily was different from Laura in many ways. She had a calm energy, a sincere smile and a way of seeing the world that seemed to bring lightness to any situation. The conversations between them flowed naturally, and Michael began to realize that, despite everything that had happened, there was still room for hope in his life. He was in no rush, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could open his heart again. Laura, on the other hand, began to face a journey of forced self-discovery. Without the support of Michael or her lover, she was faced with the need to face her own mistakes. During her community service, she met people who were facing much greater hardships than she was, and it made her reflect on how she had wasted so much in pursuit of something that would never truly satisfy her. Although loneliness was still a constant companion, Laura began to find small moments of clarity where she recognized that she needed to change. She decided to return to interior design, something she had always been passionate about, but had abandoned because she believed it wasn't enough. Maybe it was a small step, but for her, it was a start. Meanwhile, Michael received an unexpected call from his boss. He was promoted to a position that gave him more autonomy and less direct pressure, something he had long wanted but never prioritized. The promotion came as a recognition of his integrity and dedication, qualities that became even more evident during the chaos of recent months. Michael accepted the new challenge with gratitude, but with a different view on work-life balance. He knew he didn't want to repeat the same mistakes, and that included neglecting the people who really mattered. Michael's reunions with Emily became more frequent, and, over time, a sincere friendship evolved into something deeper. Emily wasn't a solution to Michael's problems, and he knew that, but she was a presence that made him see the bright side of life again. They shared laughs, dreams and simple moments, which began to fill the emptiness he carried. Michael, now more aware of his own flaws and limitations, allowed himself to dream again, but with his feet on the ground. Laura, on the other hand, continued on her lonely journey. She knew that reconciliation with Michael was impossible, but she decided that wouldn't stop her from trying to be a better person. She threw herself into her work with an intensity she had never had before, and although the emptiness was still there, she began to find little pieces of herself in each completed project, in each satisfied client. There might never be a happy ending for her, but there was at least a chance for redemption. Michael, looking back, no longer felt the crushing weight he carried before. He knew the pain of betrayal would never completely disappear, but he also knew it didn't define who he was. He had found strength in adversity, and, more importantly, he had found a way forward. With Emily by his side, he began to build a new life, a life that, although marked by the past, was full of promise for the future. Now that you've reached the end of this story, tell us what you think. Your opinion is very important and we want to know how you felt following each moment of this plot. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. Remembering that here we do not support any type of betrayal in any way. Our goal is to show how it can destroy lives and teach that choices have consequences. Until the next story.